Ready for a deep dive that might just shift your perspective?
Let's do it. Always up for a good mind-bending session.
Today, we're tackling the cultural kidnap.
This one's going to be interesting. The title alone, right, makes you wonder what you're about to get into.
Totally. It dives into this idea that we're all, well, kind of kidnapped by our own cultures.
In a way, I guess we are, aren't we? It's like we're born into this system of beliefs and behaviors that we inherit without even realizing it.
Exactly. And it shapes so much of who we are, how we see the world, even how we think.
And the book argues, in a very compelling way, I think, that a lot of what we consider free will is actually influenced by this cultural programming.
Yeah, the illusion of free will. It's a bit of a mind bender when you really start to think about it.
Absolutely. One example that really struck me was the comparison of how Inuit children in the Arctic learn versus, say, kids in a typical Western society.
Oh, yeah, they talk about that right at the beginning. It's a stark contrast. Inuit children are encouraged to learn through exploration, right?
Exactly. Just
Yeah.
figuring things out for themselves in their environment. It's very hands-on, very independent.
While in a lot of Western cultures, it's all about structured learning, classrooms, textbooks.
Yeah, it's like from day one, we're being conditioned into a certain way of thinking, a certain way of learning.
And that shapes how our brains develop, what kind of learners we become. The book calls it unconscious programming.
It's like we inherit this hidden code that influences how we perceive reality. We're playing out a script we didn't even write.
And sometimes we don't even realize there are other scripts out there.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because then you have to wonder, well, how much of what I believe is really me versus what's been ingrained in me by my culture?
Okay, so big question then. How much is free will, really? Like, if we're all products of this cultural programming.
Right. And to illustrate this, the cultural kidnap gets into some pretty thought-provoking examples, like arranged marriage in India.
Okay. It's not just some old tradition, right?
Right. For many in India, it's deeply ingrained in their culture. It's about family honor, social stability.
So it's not just a family making a decision, it's this whole cultural system at play.
Absolutely. It makes you question those Western ideas of romantic love and individual choice. Like, are those just cultural constructs too?
So it's not just customs, right? It gets even deeper. The cultural kidnap also digs into epigenetics. It's kind of wild.
Right. Epigenetics. It shows how our experiences can actually change the way our genes work.
So you're not just inheriting your parents' DNA, you're inheriting the impact of their experiences too, even if it happened generations ago.
Exactly. That Dutch hunger winter study is a powerful example of this.
For those who haven't heard of it, it was this awful famine in the Netherlands during World War II. What did they find?
Well, they found that the children who were born after the famine, even though they weren't alive during it, had a higher risk of certain health problems.
Like what?
We're talking obesity, diabetes, heart disease, things you wouldn't necessarily link to what your parents experienced before you were born.
Wow, that's incredible. And kind of scary too when you think about it.
Right. It's like this echo through generations. And what's even wilder is that researchers think some of these health risks were then passed down to their children.
It's like our DNA has a memory. Okay, so we're talking of the science. What about something like trauma?
Yeah, they get into that too. The book discusses the Rwandan genocide as an example.
Right, where the trauma experienced by survivors is believed to have led to epigenetic changes, and those changes were then passed down to their children.
Leading to an increased risk of mental health challenges in those later generations, even if they didn't directly experience the genocide themselves.
That's heavy stuff. But it shows just how deeply these experiences can reverberate through time.
And for me, it highlights the importance of addressing trauma, not just for the individuals who experience it, but for the well-being of future generations too.
Okay, so we've established that culture runs deep. So culture shapes us, even on a biological level. Pretty profound stuff.
It makes you wonder, though, who's actually doing the shaping, right? Like, who are the architects behind these invisible forces?
Right, who or what creates this cultural matrix we're all part of? It's like, where does it all come from?
The cultural kidnap digs into that too. It introduces this idea of guardians of culture.
Guardians of culture. Okay, I'm intrigued. Who are they?
They're like the keepers of the code, the ones who maintain and pass down cultural knowledge through generations.
So traditions, beliefs, values.
Exactly. They're the ones who ensure those things don't just fade away. And they can take many forms.
Like what? What are some examples of these guardians?
Well, think about Aboriginal songlines in Australia.
Okay, I've heard of those, but remind me what they are exactly.
Sure, so they're not just physical paths. They're more like living maps woven with stories and songs and rituals.
And they're passed down through generations, right?
Right. They serve as a way to transmit knowledge about the land, about history, about beliefs. So, in a way, the songlines themselves are guardians of Aboriginal culture.
Wow, that's beautiful. So the land itself is almost like a guardian too, a living embodiment of history.
Exactly. And it shows how deeply connected many indigenous cultures are to their environment. It's not just a backdrop, it's an integral part of who they are.
Makes sense. So we've got the land as a guardian. What about actual people? Like, who are the guardians in a more, I don't know, traditional sense?
Well, in many cultures, elders are seen as guardians. The book talks about groups like the Samburu and Maasai in Kenya, for example.
Oh, yeah, I know those cultures. They have a deep respect for their elders, right?
Exactly. They're seen as these wise figures holding a wealth of knowledge and experience that needs to be passed down.
It's like having a living library right there in your community. You can tap into generations of wisdom just by talking to them.
It's a powerful reminder that culture isn't static. It's actively maintained and transmitted by these guardians, whether they're telling stories, performing rituals, or just sharing their wisdom.
It's like this living, breathing thing that's constantly being shaped and reshaped by people.
And that brings us to a modern twist on the idea of cultural guardians, digital shamans.
Ooh, digital shamans. Okay, so we're in the 21st century now, right?
Exactly. Think about how much time we spend online, how much information we're bombarded with constantly,
It's like we're swimming in a sea of content.
and who's curating that content, who's deciding what we see, what we don't see. Algorithms, influencers,
Yeah.
they're all playing a role in shaping our digital landscape, which, let's face it, is a huge part of our overall cultural landscape now.
It's true. Social media has its own values, its own trends, its own way of spreading information, sometimes misinformation that spreads like wildfire.
And the book brings up some important examples of how this can have a dark side. They talk about the spread of misinformation during the Arab Spring uprisings, for instance.
Right, where social media was used to manipulate people, sometimes even incite violence.
And then there's the anti-vaccination movement, where unfounded fears about vaccines get amplified online and have real-world consequences.
It's definitely a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers.
Absolutely. We can't just passively consume information in the digital age. We need to develop strong media literacy skills to navigate this complex landscape.
So we've talked about how culture shapes our minds, even our genes. What about how it shapes our brains? Because the cultural kidnap goes there too.
Right, into the realm of neuroplasticity.
Okay, for those of us who aren't neuroscientists, remind me what that is again.
It's basically the brain's amazing ability to change and adapt throughout our lives.
So our brains aren't static. They're constantly rewiring themselves based on our experiences.
Exactly. And the book argues that culture plays a significant role in this rewiring process. They use the example of the London taxi driver study. Have you heard of that one?
Vaguely. It has something to do with how they have to memorize all those streets in London, right?
Exactly. To get their license, London caddies have to pass this notoriously difficult test called the knowledge. They have to memorize this intricate network of streets without relying on maps.
Wow, that's intense.
It is. And the researchers wanted to see if all that mental training actually changed their brains.
And did it?
It did. They found that experienced taxi drivers had larger hippocampi, which is the part of the brain that plays a key role in spatial memory.
So their brains actually adapted to meet the demands of their profession, which of course is steeped in this unique cultural landscape.
Right. And it shows how interconnected our brains and cultures really are. The way we live, the skills we learn, the environments we navigate, they all leave a physical imprint on us.
It's like our brains are being sculpted by our cultures. It's fascinating and kind of mind-blowing.
Totally. And it makes you wonder, what other ways are our brains being shaped by our cultural experiences that we don't even realize?
Right. Like, what if it's not just our environment, but also our belief systems and social structures and everything?
Exactly. The possibilities are pretty much endless.
Okay, so we've got cab drivers and their superpowered hippocampi. What other examples of this brain-culture connection does the book talk about?
Well, they talk about the Inuit people who, as you know, live in these vast icy landscapes.
And they have this incredible sense of direction, right? Like they can navigate these seemingly featureless environments without getting lost.
Exactly. And again, it's not just some innate ability. It's a skill that's been honed over generations of living in and relying on their environment.
So their brains have adapted to meet the demands of their way of life. Okay, so all this begs the question, we live in an increasingly interconnected world, right? So how do we navigate these cultural differences, these different ways of thinking and being?
Well, that's where cultural intelligence, or CQ, comes
Oh,
in.
yes, CQ. It's like having good cultural etiquette, right?
Right. It's more than just etiquette. It's the ability to understand and interact effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. It's about recognizing that those differences exist and being sensitive to them.
So, like, not just assuming everyone sees the world the way you do.
Exactly, because those different perspectives, they can be valuable sources of insight, creativity, and innovation.
So it's not just about avoiding cultural faux pas. It's about actually learning and growing from those encounters with different cultures. I like it.
Exactly. And the book argues that cultural intelligence is becoming increasingly important in our globalized world.
Makes sense. So how do we develop this cultural intelligence?
Well, it's not something you're born with, that's for sure. It's something you cultivate through exposure, mindful observation, and a willingness to step outside your comfort zone.
So, like, travel can help.
Absolutely. But it doesn't have to be some grand adventure. Even just engaging with different cultures through books, movies, art, that can broaden your perspective.
It's about being open-minded, curious about the world around you, and willing to challenge your own assumptions.
Exactly. And the book brings up some really interesting case studies to illustrate this. They talk about the Simum people of the Amazon, for instance.
What's unique about them?
Well, they live a very different lifestyle than most of us. Very active, deeply connected to nature.
All right, I'm picturing hunting and gathering and living off the land.
Exactly. And research has shown that they have remarkably low rates of cognitive decline as they age.
Wait, really? So their lifestyle, their culture, might actually be protective against things like dementia.
That's what the research suggests.
Wow. Okay, so that's incredible, right? It's like this whole other way of life that we in industrialized societies have largely lost touch with. And maybe there's something there in those traditional cultures that we can learn from, not just about how to prevent cognitive decline, but also about how to live richer, more meaningful lives.
It's a good reminder that different cultures have different strengths, different wisdom to offer, and we can learn so much from being open to those different perspectives. The book also delves into the lives of third culture kids.
Third culture kids, those are the folks who've grown up in multiple cultures, right?
Right. They've often spent significant portions of their childhoods moving between different countries, experiencing different languages, different customs, different ways of life.
That must be a fascinating, albeit challenging, way to grow up.
It can be. They often talk about feeling like they don't fully belong anywhere, like they're constantly navigating between different worlds.
Yeah, like they carry a bit of each culture within them, but don't fully identify with just one.
Exactly. But the upside is that they often develop this incredible adaptability, this flexibility in how they see the world and interact with others.
And they often end up with a high CQ, I'm guessing.
Often, they do.
Yeah.
And their experiences underscore the idea that cultural identity isn't fixed or static. It can be fluid, adaptable, and increasingly complex, especially in our globalized world.
So we've talked about how culture shapes our minds, our brains, our understanding of the world. But the cultural kidnap doesn't just stop at our minds. It also delves into how culture influences something else very fundamental to the human experience.
Are you talking about food?
Food, exactly. It's not just fuel, right?
Not at all. Food is deeply cultural. It's a
Mhm.
reflection of values, traditions, history. Think about it. Every culture has its own unique cuisine, its own rituals around food.
It's like a whole other language we use to connect with each other and express who we are.
Beautifully put.
So take us on a culinary journey. What are some of the ways the cultural kidnap explores the intersection of food and culture? We could talk about food for a whole other deep dive, but we're getting close to the end of this one.
Time flies when you're exploring the nuances of culture, right?
It really does. But before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on the author himself, Willem DeWit. He brings such a unique perspective to this topic.
Absolutely. You can tell he's not just some academic writing about culture from a distance. He's lived it.
Yeah, the introduction mentions he spent decades traveling, immersing himself in different cultures, spiritual traditions. It's like he lived the book before he wrote it.
Exactly. And that firsthand experience really comes through in his writing. You can feel the authenticity, the depth of his understanding.
It makes the book so much more engaging to read, you know? It's not just a dry analysis, it's personal, almost like he's inviting you on this journey of discovery with him.
It's really well written, too. He manages to tackle these complex ideas in a way that's both thought-provoking and accessible.
Totally. One of his central messages that really resonated with me is this idea that we're not just passive recipients of this cultural programming. We actually have the power to shape our own cultural identities. Like we can become more conscious participants rather than just products of our upbringing.
He calls for a cultural awakening. I love that. It's about waking up to these influences that are shaping us, recognizing that we have a choice in how we respond to them.
It's like realizing you've been playing a character in a play, and then suddenly you have this aha moment where you realize, wait, I can write my own lines.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And the book offers some really practical ways to start doing that too. He emphasizes mindfulness, for one.
Being present in the moment, observing your thoughts and feelings without judgment, especially when you encounter something that challenges your assumptions.
Exactly. It's about hitting the pause button on autopilot, becoming more aware of those automatic reactions and thought patterns that are often culturally conditioned.
And then, along with mindfulness, he talks about the importance of critical thinking.
Right, questioning assumptions, not just blindly accepting what you've been told, being curious, seeking out different perspectives.
It's like becoming a cultural detective. Like, why do I believe this? Where did this belief come from? Is it serving me?
Exactly. And of course, he talks about the importance of engaging with different cultures.
Which, as you were saying earlier, doesn't necessarily require hopping on a plane.
Right. You can travel the world through books, movies, art, even just striking up a conversation with someone from a different background than your own can be an incredibly enriching experience.
It's about expanding your horizons, challenging those ingrained biases that you might not even realize you have.
And that's how we start to bridge those divides, those cultural misunderstandings that can lead to so much conflict in the world.
It all comes back to that idea of taking ownership of your cultural journey.
Exactly. You can passively accept the cultural script you've been handed, or you can choose to become a more conscious, more intentional creator of your own identity.
That's a powerful message. And it feels particularly relevant today, with all the division and polarization we're seeing in the world.
Absolutely. We need new ways of thinking, new ways of relating to each other if we're going to create a more just and equitable world.
And I think the Cultural Kidnap offers some valuable insights into how we can start doing that. So for our listeners who are feeling inspired, ready to embark on their own cultural awakening, what's one key takeaway they can apply to their own lives starting today?
You are not just a product of your culture. You are an architect of your own identity. Remember that. You have the power to choose how you want to be shaped by the world around you. Use that power wisely.
Love it. Become a conscious navigator. Be aware of the currents, but chart your own course. That's the adventure of being human. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked some new ideas and inspired you to look at your own cultural journey with fresh eyes.